Hello, Saint Bennett's, and welcome to my hideout and to this session of the Tuesday talks in the time of the plague. The next 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about my doctoral research. More precisely, I'm going to talk about some of the methodological and theoretical questions that I've been pondering that might at first sound a bit dry, but I promise I'll try to keep it lively, which actually shouldn't be too hard to do because the underlying science and the scholarship on which I base many of my propositions and hypotheses is actually truly fascinating. But because this comes out of my doctoral research, I should first give you an overview of what this project is about in its entirety. So that's what I'm going to do first. Then I will home in on what I mean by the term affective realism. And then lastly, I'll give you some examples, some illustrations from my empirical work, from my case studies, which are dealing with Russian foreign policy, with Russian relations with the US and Europe, to be more exact. So at the start of my doctoral work was really this puzzle presented by Russian foreign policy. I was wondering, are we making good enough use of the academic tools for foreign policy analysis that we have available, or could we improve explanations of Russian foreign policy, of continuity and change in Russian Western relations? Especially today, it's pretty hard to overstate why Russian interests are important. Now, while material indicators, which, for example, could be GDP, size of population, the military expenditure, while these indicators might suggest that in continuing to pursue an assertive course versus Europe and the US, Russia might be punching above its weight. Yet, arguably, its influence around the world appears to have grown over the last 2 decades. And there have been a few concrete issues that have been widely debated in the media, in popular discourse that I'm sure all of you are aware of. For example, the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in 2018, or more recently, the attack on opposition politician Alexei Navalny and his subsequent differences of opinion over his judicial treatment. But there are also some more substantial security issues and strategic issues that sometimes tend to fly under the radar in media and public discourse. For example, the expiration of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and Russia's exit from the Open Skies Treaty, the modernization and build-up of Russian armed forces, including the development of new tactical nuclear weapons, and of course, continued allegations of meddling in the affairs of its neighboring countries. And all of that suggests that Russia is challenging the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, if not the rules-based international order more broadly. So that's the long answer to the question why studying Russia is important. And if you follow any of the issues I just mentioned at all, you know there is a wide spectrum of opinion on Russian politics and Russian foreign relations in the media and in public opinion generally. And the debate in academic international relations, in foreign policy analysis, is just as fragmented. In part, that is also due to differences in worldviews or political predilections on part of the analysts, of the scholars Now, that's not what I am looking at. I am looking at differences with respect to analytical approach, theory, method, and how that might lead to vastly different results. Doing that, I inevitably ended up with the major schools of thought in international relations that also inform foreign policy analysis to a significant degree. And there we have liberalism, for lack of a better term, liberalism and approaches focusing on the domestic politics and how that impacts foreign policy decisions. And that usually traces Russian foreign policy back to authoritarian tendencies in domestic politics. Then we have structural realism, which emphasizes the balance of material power, the balance of military power between states. And structural realists have concluded that Russian behavior is not surprising and is the inevitable result of the faulty, ideologically driven Western policy, actually. And constructivists have argued that Russia's assertive turn might be the product of a process of identity formation with respect to Europe. So I found that part of the reason why academic analysis on Russian foreign policy has such a mixed track record lies with some faults associated with these theoretical schools that I mentioned earlier. They have difficulty integrating actors, foreign policy actors, and structures. They might be limited by the assumption of the rational actor, or they suffer from cognitive biases. And what I also found is that there is surprisingly little research on what we in international relations call first level analyses, which are focused on the individual and individual psychology, what used to be referred to as human nature. But lately, an effort went underway to re-engage with what's called the cognitive psychological micro-foundations of social action. And what I do, I see very much as part of that effort. So to be more precise, what I do is I'm trying to integrate or build on classical realist theory in international relations and combine that with contemporary research in the life sciences, particularly psychology and neuroscience. And I do that in order to theorize the role of affect and emotion in foreign policy decision making. So why would I draw on this ancient body of scholarship that is classical realism? The term subsumes scholars ranging all the way from Thucydides in antiquity to Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and in the 20th century, I am drawing especially on a scholar named, an American-German scholar named Hans Morgenthau. I found that their work, which is grounded in diplomatic practice and decades of experience, expresses a very sophisticated conception, a very intuitive conception, really, of executive motivation, of political executives, and an intuitive understanding of how emotion, how affect and emotion and cognition play together, which has incidentally been confirmed by neuroscience more recently, in that emotion and cognition are really much closer connected than was once believed. And finally, with respect to classical realism and why I'm choosing affect and emotion as a theoretical vehicle, if you will, it was also suggested in these texts that analysis should be based on general mental processes, what Morgenthau called repetitive patterns of the mind, rather than more elusive personal motives. To put that differently, affect and emotion have an advantage over other psychological concepts that are used in international relations, in that they are a very general human phenomenon that has been studied quite extensively across different disciplines. And a survey of the interdisciplinary literature is also what lies at the basis, or what forms the foundation of this model that I'm talking about today, which is affective realism. And the term designates a framework, or a template, if you will, for conducting foreign policy analysis. Now, instead of going over the specifics of this framework, or boring you with definitions, I want to go over some questions that I pondered as I was developing it, and that one needs to answer in order to theorize the role of affect and emotion in foreign policy. I said no definitions, but we need to engage with one definition, and that is, how do we classify, how do we categorize affect and emotion? And here, generally, affect is the umbrella term. It's a broader term that encompasses emotions, that encompasses dispositions, that encompasses feelings, attitudes, moods. Moods, for example, would be more diffuse affective states that generally last a bit longer, but are perceived to be less intense. And that is also how you measure emotion, by how intense or how salient the experience is. When affect enters our consciousness, we may recognize it as a feeling, but it might also remain at a level below conscious awareness in the form of a bias. Only when an affective response has a distinct cognitive profile and also a socially recognizable expression, then we speak of emotions. And there is a set of affective phenomena that have particularly distinct such profiles, and that would be the primary emotions, such as anger, fear, happiness, sadness. And these tend to be universal across cultures. Another big question which I've dealt with in the context of this research concerns accessibility and provability. Anyone working on conceptions of affect and emotion in the social sciences will inevitably have to answer the question how they intend to identify affective responses and distinguish between their deliberate instrumental display on the one side and their spontaneous, possibly even unintentional expression, because only the latter category, it is assumed, would be useful in making inferences as to the actor's true motivations. And only the latter category would yield useful insights into their decision-making process. Now, unfortunately, as long as political leaders are somewhat reluctant to undergo brain imaging as part of their daily routine, there's not going to be any surefire way of telling these affective phenomena apart. As is evidenced by this very important and very serious visual aid, when we think about some political leaders, emotion may not be the first thing that comes to mind. However, there are some things, some properties of emotion that do work in our advantage, us as in analysts or scholars working with these concepts. That even the most skillful and calculating politicians are subject to some physiological truths. That's the argument here. Emotions, more often than not, are difficult to hide. And individuals are often not even aware of the emotions they express in their behavior for neurological reasons, because physiological activation begins before individuals become fully cognizant of events that induced an affective process. Another important finding that should work in our favor, is that some emotions want to be expressed. For example, the experience of anger triggers an urge to communicate it. Anger has a very important function in interpersonal communication, in that it lends credibility to one's statements, or it can be used to convey that a very significant normative boundary, or a red line, as is often used in political discourse, has been crossed. You need to show through your anger, through your outrage, that you actually care about an issue in order to be perceived as credible. The less we know about the actual decisions, about the actual decision-making processes involved in a foreign policy case, the more important the psychological dimension actually becomes. Even if emotions were somehow reliably recorded, ultimately we could be sure of leaders' thoughts and feelings, whether they are real or not, or staged. But that should not prohibit any attempt at micro level, or at psychology-based explanations of Russian behavior or any foreign policy case study. As with other psychological approaches to international relations, such as research on motivation and perception, empirical evidence is often inconclusive. But as you go about contrasting and complementing different perspectives on foreign policy, necessary evidence, as opposed to sufficient evidence, can be just as useful. So these are some of the data points, some of the concepts, some of the research that I gathered in order to develop this framework of effective realism. I should also mention that I'm not the first one to use that term. It already exists in neuroscience, was developed by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and it's different to the way I use it in my dissertation, but there are some similarities. One very important one, in that both models emphasize the predictive function of the brain. I also mentioned the inspiration I've drawn from classical scholars with respect to the psychological, sociological, and psycholinguistic literature and sources that I'm using. I have relied heavily on the authors that I'm listing at the bottom of the screen here. So just a few introductory words on this model. It consists of 3 dimensions: appraisal, action tendencies, and attitude. And those 3 dimensions are representing the main mechanisms through which the lived experience of leaders and foreign policy elites is shaped by affect. In other words, the 3 dimensions are ways in which we can conceptualize different aspects of affect, and insofar as they bear on policymakers. Based primarily on appraisal theories of emotion, the basic premise here is that emotions are adaptive responses indicative of the appraisal of environmental conditions for the individual's well-being. And well-being depends in turn on whether individuals consider objects or events in their environment as being conducive to or obstructing their concerns. Now that was a mouthful. Let me try and put that a bit in more simple terms. If appraisal colors how individuals think or how individuals experience, action tendencies shape not only what they think, but also what they wish would happen next. Now, action tendencies is not meant to suggest that we, using this model or any of this research, that we can reliably predict what someone will do when they're faced with a certain situation or when they experience a certain emotion. This is a game of probabilities rather than a model that enables 100% accurate predictions every time. But generally speaking, action tendencies consist of a standard response pattern. And these standard response patterns were evolutionarily selected for. These are often characterized as automatic, non-deliberate, even primitive urges toward action. Most well known among them, probably the fight or flight response. Now, in the context of international politics, punching someone in the face or running away from a meeting is generally not considered in accordance with proper diplomatic protocol. So it's reasonable to conclude that there's something else at work. And Lazarus has termed this as coping mechanisms. And these draw on the assessment of different coping options, what is possible, what is likely to be effective in a specific context, and what is compatible with social and personal standards of conduct. All in an effort to reintroduce the previously existing desired affective state. And finally, attitude is built over time. It denotes a process by which experience is transformed into a more permanent disposition or attitude, which determines the quality of subsequent interpersonal interactions and policies in this context. So with this chart, I want to illustrate show the components of the appraisal process and how we can connect these theoretical concepts with the actual verbal representations, verbal expressions of emotion that we might encounter in foreign policy discourse. And I simply wanted to show this chart to show that meticulous description of the process is the key here. I've used something called a natural semantic meta-language approach. And the aim here is to verbally deconstruct the emotion process and to find semantic explications or formal representations of meaning, which we can then which we can get by deconstructing the emotion process in such a way. To issue a final caveat, the approach that I'm presenting here is probabilistic, and it is mainly a didactic device. So it presents a process of progressively narrowing appraisal, which leads to an effective response, and that gives us an indication of when and how emotions such as fear and anger might matter in foreign policy. Some preliminary conclusions from my empirical work. And here I want to focus on the larger trends in Russian foreign policy rather than specific foreign policy decisions where an effective response might have promoted one action tendency or one course of action over another. But I want to focus instead on the sort of larger behavioral patterns in Russian-Western relations. I mentioned earlier that there is also in academic foreign policy analysis a large, a vast spectrum of different opinions on Russia, on Russian foreign policy, and even approaches that are ostensibly using the same theoretical tools yield conclusions that are diametrically opposed. For example, there is a large and steadily growing literature on status concerns that often use Russia and China as an example. And often, or much of that is staked on a concept from social psychology that's called social identity theory. Whereas one side of the debate argues that the other side is making, in the case of Russia, an unfounded case for accommodating Russia's status concerns versus taking a more assertive position towards Russia and containing its ambitions. Now, the contribution that I want to make to this literature is specifying what is really at the core of much of these arguments, which is the emotion of anger, anger over the denial of Russian great power status, and to that extent, I aim to show in my descriptions of individual interactions between Russian and Western officials how precisely elites' anger over the perceived inability to influence Western policy might promote tendencies towards more assertive action. The difference, I argue, lies in different perceptions of the security and the legitimacy of the status hierarchy itself. Is exemplified by Russia's shift from contesting US unipolarity in the early 2000s to challenging the rules-based liberal order altogether a couple of years later. So, like I said, a lot of the contributions to the literature on status concerns relies on the emotion of anger or, relatedly, perceptions of what constitutes unfair treatment at their core. But often it does so without detailing how the emotion and the concept of status are linked together. So that's where I try to make a contribution and offer a preliminary response. I think anger is both a consequence of status denial as well as a signifier of the beginnings of an attempt to restore status and dignity. I also aim to show that there are different manifestations of a primary emotion, such as anger. For example, I make the argument that there was a change in the attitude of Russian elites towards their Western counterparts and Western centers of power around during the time of Putin's first two terms as president. A change in the affective attitude from resentment to contempt. Political scientist Ivar Neumann has made an analogous argument when he said that he was using social psychology to argue that somewhere along the line the collective psychology of Russia's foreign policy establishment shifted from an inferiority to a superiority complex. So what I try to do is lay out how this works at the level of individual psychology. Leaders' experience of anger changes with the perception of the other side. If the other side is being perceived as higher up in the social hierarchy, the resulting emotion is resentment. If others are being perceived as lower, contempt results. And it can actually be traced in the larger picture of Russian foreign policy discourse. By the mid-2000s, perspectives regarding Europe had changed fundamentally from a model that was to be emulated by the Russian political elite to and talk of a common European home and wanting to emulate the Western economic model. By the mid-2000s, that had given way to representations of Europe as something other, something false, even something rotten. And the intensity or the salience of these expressions already gives an indication that the pattern of action tendencies that is being promoted by these experiences is vastly different. Contempt is much more problematic than resentment or anger more broadly. First, because its probable action tendencies are distinctly more assertive, more aggressive even, and that's because contempt is more self-empowering. It includes the discernment that something can be done to change the situation, to take action, to be able to take action against a perceived injustice, which resentment doesn't encompass. Second, because contempt negates empathy, the ability to take the other side's view. And it's not hard to see how empathy is actually a cornerstone of successful or an integral part of successful diplomacy. And finally, I'd like to make a few points with respect to the other emotion, the other primary emotion, which I've mentioned, that features prominently in my empirical work, which is fear. Now, the concept of fear has already a prominent place in the IR literature. It has, however, been studied mainly in the context of rationalist approaches, of deterrence, for example, bargaining, strategic choice, signaling theory. But the ways in which the experience of fear or the experience of loss aversion, which is often comes out to the same thing, the ways in which these experiences impact state leaders on a personal level has received comparatively less attention. And it just struck me that it might be interesting to study how that might feature in cases of foreign policy. If you look at someone like Vladimir Putin, with every additional month in office, he and the likes of him have more to lose and fewer ways out. In the case of Putin, who arguably appears convinced that the prosperity and security of Russia depend on him, it's not just the personal legacy or his political legacy that's at stake. More substantively, it's his financial and physical security that's at stake. And making matters worse, as clinical psychologists who have written on politics have remarked, with such an extensive time in office come detachment, hubris, fear of persecution, and a range of other phenomena that have been well documented among political executives. All of that raises the stakes in the perception of the leader and provides fertile ground for high intensity emotional or affective responses. But also the lower intensity variant of affect might have significant consequences. If we look at fear, if fear becomes permanent, we speak of conditioned fear, and it lasts longer than the initial threat, then the result is that individuals become more conscious, of course, of potential future threats. They become hypervigilant. And in addition to being worse at calculating the costs, the risks, and the benefits of their choices, individuals that are thus conditioned frequently fail to see how their behavior, even if it's intended as defensive, might be seen as threatening. And that's enhancing cognitive biases that might already exist. So, summing up, studying these affective phenomena, explicating them, in other words, picking them apart, also enables us to hypothesize under what conditions particular concerns such as security or military might or territory or status and prestige or values and worldviews matter, and when one concern matters more than others. In the case of Russia, in the course of my research, I observed that oftentimes Russia is more willing to compromise on hard security issues than it would be on matters of worldview and its value system. So that's perhaps another preliminary conclusion or takeaway that I can draw. And that's where I want to end it. And I am including here on this slide some of the material, some of the literature that I've brought up, and also an article that has come out of this work, if anyone's interested. And if you want to discuss any of these things further, you can do so right after the talk, or be happy to hear from you in a private message. Thank you.